Philadelphia 1980s. A city that never slept, ruled not by loyalty, not by respect, but by fear. In the shadows stood Nicodemo, little Nicky, Scarfo, the most paranoid Don America had ever seen. He trusted no one. Not his men. Not his family. Not even his own silence. Every glance was a threat. Every pause was betrayal. Tonight we step inside the sleepless kingdom Scarfo built, an empire of suspicion that rose in whispers and collapsed in echoes. This is the story of how fear crowned a king, and how fear destroyed him. Philadelphia was never gentle to its children. In the cramped streets of South Philly during the 1920s and 30s, boys grew up learning that survival was earned, not given. Every corner had its own rules, every block its own code. And in one of those row houses, small, brick, unremarkable, a boy named Nicodemo Scarfo was learning lessons that would shape not only his life, but the uneasy rhythm of an entire city decades later. Scarfo was small, wiry, and quick. The other kids called him Little Nicky, half in jest, half in warning. Because what he lacked in size he made up for in sharpness. A sharp tongue, a sharp glare, and soon, a sharp sense of where power came from. It wasn't from being liked. It wasn't from being trusted. In fact, it was often the opposite. As the Great Depression dragged across America, families in South Philly tightened their belts and tightened their fists. Breadlines formed outside churches, mothers whispered prayers over empty tables, and fathers worked shifts that left their bodies broken. But young Scarfo watched something else in those years. He saw how fear could move men faster than hunger. A landlord knocking on the door sent fathers scrambling to borrow money. A neighborhood tough passing on the corner sent boys retreating indoors. Fear bent people. And Scarfo decided early that he wanted to be the one who bent, not the one who broke. The 1940s came with war overseas and change at home. Scarfo grew into a teenager who never quite lost that chip on his shoulder. Teachers described him as restless, distracted. He wasn't the type to sit still in a classroom, not when the real lessons were unfolding in alleys and bars, in whispered deals and unpaid debts. He hung around older boys, the kind who wore suits a little too sharp for their paychecks, the kind who always had a roll of cash for drinks. They carried themselves with confidence, but Scarfo noticed something else. The way people got quiet when they walked in. Respect, yes, but beneath it, fear. By the 1950s, Scarfo's path was clear. He wasn't meant for honest work. He wasn't meant to clock in at a factory, punch a card, and shuffle home with grease on his hands. He wanted more. He wanted the power he'd glimpsed in those neighborhood wise guys, the invisible crown they wore that made men step aside. But even then, Scarfo was different from most who sought the life. Where others wanted camaraderie, the sense of brotherhood the mob promised, Scarfo held himself apart. He didn't believe in brotherhood. He believed in survival. And survival, he thought, was a lonely business. Those early years in the mob world were not glamorous. They were small jobs, petty rackets, moments of violence that came suddenly and ended quietly. Scarfo learned quickly that silence was a weapon. He didn't boast about what he did. He didn't brag. He let others talk too much, reveal too much, and in that talking he saw weakness. Scarfo's paranoia, what some called his curse, was already becoming his strength. There's a story told from those years, whispered more than written. A fellow associate once joked too casually about Scarfo's height, about little Nicky being too small to be taken seriously. Scarfo laughed with the others, but later, that associate found himself on the receiving end of Scarfo's sudden rage. It wasn't just the insult. It was the principle. Scarfo decided in that moment, no slight, however small, would go unanswered. If you allowed one, you allowed them all. This philosophy, harsh as it was, began to earn him a reputation. Not as the most powerful man, not yet, but as the most dangerous to underestimate. The years rolled on. Atlantic City became Scarfo's stage, a city caught between fading seaside charm and the neon promises of casinos. There, Scarfo carved out a role as an enforcer. Violence was not foreign to him, but it was the paranoia beneath it that made him effective. He didn't just strike at enemies. He struck at the possibility of enemies. If a man might betray him, if a deal might sour, Scarfo acted before it happened. Better to burn a bridge than risk it collapsing under your feet. But that same paranoia kept him isolated. Where other mobsters built tight crews, Scarfo kept his men at arm's length. Associates described dinners where the laughter was forced, where Scarfo's eyes lingered on each face too long, as though measuring hidden intentions. One said, you never felt comfortable around him. You felt watched. Like he was waiting for you to slip. And yet, in a world where betrayal was as common as bread, Scarfo's approach seemed logical. Mob history is littered with men who trusted too much. Men who shared too freely. Men who let friendship blind them to ambition. Scarfo refused to be one of them. By the late 1970s, as Philadelphia's underworld shifted and alliances cracked, Scarfo was poised to rise. He wasn't the most charismatic. He wasn't the most beloved. But when the city needed a boss, what it got was Scarfo, the small man with the sharp eyes, the man whose paranoia had been preparing him for power his entire life. And when he finally sat in that chair, when he finally wore the crown of Philadelphia's mob, he ruled the only way he knew how, through suspicion, through silence, through fear. Because to Nicodemo, little Nicky, Scarfo, paranoia wasn't madness. It was the only thing that kept him alive. The ocean air of Atlantic City was thick with contradictions. By day, the boardwalk glittered with neon lights, tourists eating saltwater taffy, and families clutching buckets of clams. By night, it transformed into a different city entirely, a place where promises were made in whispers, where debts were collected with fists, and where men like Nicodemo Scarfo began to shape their legends. Scarfo found himself drawn to Atlantic City in the years before the casinos arrived. He wasn't there for the fun. He wasn't there for the glamour. He was there because the city's underbelly had opportunities, contracts to skim, construction deals to muscle into, unions to control. In a place where fortunes rose and fell overnight, paranoia wasn't just useful, it was essential. Scarfo started small, enforcing, collecting, intimidating. But what set him apart wasn't just his willingness to use violence. It was his readiness to imagine betrayal before it ever appeared. To Scarfo, every handshake was a test. Every smile was a mask. He carried himself as though he were forever surrounded by enemies, even in a room full of supposed allies. And maybe, in a way, he was right. Atlantic City was crawling with men who saw themselves as players, hustlers, big shots in shiny suits. They laughed too loud, bragged too much, and trusted too easily. Scarfo, small in stature, quiet in demeanor, stood apart. He was the man in the corner who said little, whose eyes scanned the room like a predator in tall grass. People underestimated him. They thought little Nicky was a joke. But those who pushed too far soon learned that Scarfo's paranoia carried teeth. One story from the mid-1960s tells of a contractor who tried to short Scarfo's cut on a job. It wasn't a large sum. Others might have let it slide, chalked it up to business. Not Scarfo. To him, the shortfall wasn't about money, it was about trust. If a man stole a dime today, he'd steal $1 tomorrow. So Scarfo made an example. The contractor's car was torched, his windows smashed, his nights suddenly filled with shadows on the street. He got the message. Scarfo didn't forgive slights, and he certainly didn't forget them. But paranoia came with costs too. Scarfo didn't laugh easily. He didn't drink much, didn't party with the others. Even among mobsters who thrived on secrecy, Scarfo was seen as distant. Men said you could never really be close with him. At most, you were tolerated. At worst, you were suspected. The arrival of legalized gambling in the 1970s changed everything. Atlantic City exploded with money. Casinos rose like fortresses, promising jobs and fortunes. To the mob, it was a gold mine. And Scarfo, who had spent years positioning himself in the shadows, suddenly found himself in the spotlight. The Philadelphia family needed a man in Atlantic City, someone to oversee the new empire of cards and dice. Scarfo, quiet and paranoid as he was, became that man. It wasn't an obvious choice. Some saw him as too small, too volatile, too distrustful. But others recognized that in a world where casinos moved millions every night, they needed someone who wouldn't blink. Scarfo's paranoia, once a weakness, became a weapon. He watched every dollar, questioned every excuse, punished every misstep. Where another man might have let money slip through cracks, Scarfo sealed those cracks with fear. Philadelphia itself, meanwhile, was no calmer. The city was a powder keg with rival factions vying for control, alliances fraying, and blood spilling in the streets. Scarfo's paranoia was well suited for the times. In a world where betrayal was inevitable, who better to lead than a man who expected it every hour of every day? By the early 1980s, Scarfo's name was spoken in the same breath as fear itself. He wasn't loved. He wasn't admired. But he was respected in the most dangerous way. People feared what he might do if they disappointed him. Even his closest men admitted they never truly felt safe in his presence. One associate said later, "With Nicky you never knew. One day you're breaking bread with him. The next day you're gone." He trusted no one, not even himself. What Scarfo built in those years wasn't just an empire of money and rackets. He built an empire of silence. His paranoia seeped into the bones of the men who worked for him. They stopped talking freely, stopped laughing openly, stopped confiding in each other. Under Scarfo's reign, every conversation felt like a trap, every word a potential betrayal. In that silence, Scarfo thrived. He believed he had bent the world to his philosophy. Better to kill the wrong man than to trust the wrong one. Yet even as he consolidated power, cracks were forming. The very paranoia that kept him alive also kept him isolated. The fear that made others obey also made them despise him. And in the shadows of Philadelphia, resentment was growing. But for now, in the early 1980s, Scarfo was at his peak. A small man with sharp eyes, ruling a city not through loyalty, not through charisma, but through suspicion so deep it infected every streetlight, every whispered deal, every sleepless night. The late 1970s carried with them a strange electricity in Philadelphia. The city was restless. Factories were closing, unions were swelling with anger, and violence spilled into neighborhoods that once prided themselves on order. For Scarfo it was the perfect storm. Atlantic City, newly reborn with casinos, was pumping cash like a beating heart. But every pulse of money carried with it danger. Politicians wanted their cut. Police wanted their piece. Rival mobsters wanted control. Scarfo sat at the center of it all, his small frame almost swallowed by the chaos around him, yet his eyes sharper than ever. His paranoia had hardened into ritual. Each night, he would check the locks himself, pacing through rooms as though searching for ghosts. Windows were covered, blinds pulled tight, televisions kept at low volume. Associates who came to see him described the atmosphere as suffocating. It felt like being watched, one later said. Even when it was just him, it felt like eyes were everywhere. Scarfo tested his men constantly. He would give them small tasks with no real importance just to see if they hesitated, if they slipped, if they carried the weight of secrets in their tone. Some passed. Others failed, and for them the punishment was swift. The message was clear. With Scarfo, trust was never assumed. It was earned each day, and it could vanish in an instant. One night in 1978, Scarfo summoned a group of associates to a meeting in Atlantic City. They arrived expecting business. What they found instead was a lecture. Scarfo spoke slowly, softly, but every word cut like a blade. This life is not about friendship, he told them. It's not about loyalty. It's about survival. And survival means you don't trust a man just because he smiles. You don't believe a word just because it sounds sweet. You watch. You wait. And you act before he does. Those who listened nodded in silence. Those who doubted him didn't last long. Scarfo's paranoia was contagious. Even men who once laughed at the idea began to mirror his habits, checking their backs in mirrors, carrying weapons to the dinner table, avoiding conversations that felt too warm. By the dawn of the 1980s, Scarfo's reputation was sealed. He was not just another mobster. He was the embodiment of suspicion itself. In the neighborhoods of South Philly, mothers whispered his name as a warning. In Atlantic City, casino bosses lowered their eyes when he entered. And in the underworld, where betrayal was the currency of survival, Scarfo was king because he lived as though betrayal had already happened. But paranoia is a heavy crown. It weighed on him constantly. Scarfo's health faltered. His nights shortened, his temper sharpened. He became unpredictable, volatile, capable of warmth one hour and cold fury the next. Associates described dinners where laughter was cut short by silence when Scarfo's gaze narrowed. One too many jokes, one too many glances, and suddenly the evening ended with tension so thick it followed them home. And yet, for all its costs, paranoia kept him alive. Rivals who thought to challenge him hesitated, fearing that Scarfo already suspected their move. Politicians who might have squeezed harder backed off, wary of the quiet storm in his eyes. Even law enforcement struggled. Scarfo's secrecy, his lack of open camaraderie, left fewer cracks to exploit. This was the paradox of Scarfo. His paranoia isolated him, but it also protected him. It made him feared, hated, distrusted, but it also made him untouchable. By 1981, Philadelphia's mob world was on the edge of collapse. Bosses had fallen. Alliances were crumbling. The city needed a leader, and though few would have chosen him for his charm, though many whispered about his volatility, the truth was undeniable. Nicodemo, little Nicky Scarfo, was ready. His entire life had been a rehearsal for this moment. The small boy from South Philly, mocked for his size, dismissed as too quiet, had built himself into a man whose silence spoke louder than gunfire. His empire would not be built on trust. It would not be built on brotherhood. It would be built on suspicion so deep, so unrelenting, that every man around him would live in its shadow. And in that shadow Scarfo would rule. Thus began the reign of Philadelphia's most paranoid don. Scarfo's childhood had taught him that fear bends men faster than hunger. His youth had shown him that trust kills quicker than bullets. And his rise in Atlantic City proved that paranoia, sharpened and disciplined, could become a crown. The stage was set. The 1980s loomed ahead, and with them Scarfo's silent kingdom, an empire of suspicion, a reign of unease, a story written not in blood alone, but in the endless weight of fear. Philadelphia, 1981. The city had grown tired of blood, but blood still ran through its streets. Bosses had fallen. Power shifted like sand in a storm. The Philadelphia crime family, once steady under the old guard, now stood fractured, its throne empty, its men restless, its enemies circling. Into this chaos stepped a small man with sharp eyes. Nicodemo, little Nicky. Scarfo had been waiting for this moment his entire life. He didn't inherit his crown through love or respect. He seized it through something colder, something sharper, fear. Scarfo's rise was not celebrated. There were no parades, no joyful toasts in smoky backrooms. Instead there was silence. The kind of silence that comes when men look at each other and wonder who will survive the next year. Scarfo wasn't the kind of boss you wanted. But in the world of Philadelphia's underworld, he was the kind of boss you got. The ceremony of silence. When Scarfo was formally recognized as boss, the ritual was subdued. Men kissed his hand, swore their loyalty, muttered the words they had spoken to leaders before him. But behind their eyes was unease. They knew Scarfo's paranoia. They knew his temper. And they knew that from this moment on, every gesture, every glance, every pause in conversation would be judged with suspicion. Scarfo himself said little. He didn't need to. His reputation was already carved into the bones of the family. Men remembered the contractor whose car was torched. They remembered the associates who disappeared after careless jokes. They remembered that Scarfo never forgave and he never forgot. His silence was louder than any speech, building a throne of fear. The early days of Scarfo's rule were marked not by expansion, but by tightening control. He scrutinized everything: money, movements, conversations. Soldiers complained that no decision was too small for Scarfo's eye. Who got which union job, who skimmed what off the top, who spoke too long with outsiders, all of it was cataloged in Scarfo's mind. Meetings became ordeals. Associates would sit stiffly, their hands folded, their voices careful. Scarfo would sit at the head of the table, small in stature but immense in presence. He rarely smiled. Instead, he let silence stretch, forcing men to fill it, watching how their words betrayed them. Some bosses built their empires on charisma, on the warmth of brotherhood. Scarfo built his on tension. He believed that if a man relaxed, he became careless. And carelessness was death. The reach of paranoia. Scarfo's paranoia seeped into the city itself. In South Philly, residents whispered that the mob was more dangerous than ever. Business owners paid their dues promptly, terrified of what might happen otherwise. Union leaders, once bold in their negotiations, now carried themselves with caution, aware that Scarfo's men were watching. Even within his own family, fear was currency. Capos who once schemed openly against bosses now thought twice. They knew Scarfo's eyes were everywhere. They knew he trusted no one. And they knew that in his world, suspicion alone was enough to end a life. One capo later recalled, "It wasn't that he knew everything. It was that you believed he did. And that belief, that fear, kept you in line. Nights without rest." Scarfo himself lived in the same tension he imposed on others. His nights were restless. He slept lightly, if at all, a pistol never far from reach. Associates who visited his Atlantic City condo described blinds perpetually drawn, televisions turned low, conversations hushed. Scarfo lived as though every wall had ears, as though every window was a rifle scope. This life was exhausting, but to Scarfo it was necessary. To trust was to die. To rest was to weaken. And so he remained on edge, every moment of every day, until paranoia was no longer just a habit, it was his identity. Philadelphia in the early 1980s was a city with two faces. By day, its skyline hinted at progress. New buildings rising, commerce buzzing, tourists drifting through Independence Hall as if the city itself were an open-air museum of American resilience. By night, though, another face appeared. This one was marked by shadows in alleyways, whispers exchanged under neon bar signs, and the ever-present sense that someone was always watching. At the center of this nocturnal city sat Nicodemo, little Nicky, Scarfo. Scarfo's paranoia did not remain confined to his private rituals. It shaped his governance of the mob itself. His empire was not organized around opportunity, it was organized around suspicion. Every soldier, every capo, Every associate was under scrutiny. In Scarfo's world, loyalty was a temporary condition, renewed each day, revoked at the slightest hint of betrayal. The testing of allegiance. Scarfo was infamous for his loyalty tests. These were not formal ceremonies, not rituals with witnesses. They were quiet, almost invisible maneuvers designed to probe the men around him. One soldier might be told to deliver an envelope to a contact who didn't exist, just to see if he opened it. Another might be asked to repeat instructions to a third man, and Scarfo would watch whether the details shifted. Even casual conversations were traps. Scarfo would drop fragments of false information, then wait to hear whether those words returned to him through another mouth. When betrayal was uncovered, or even suspected, punishment came swiftly. Some were beaten. Others vanished. Scarfo did not always announce these decisions. Sometimes a chair at the weekly meeting simply sat empty, the absence itself a louder warning than any speech. The effect was chilling. Men began censoring themselves, measuring their words like accountants tallying figures. In Scarfo's family, silence became the safest language. Fear as a business model. Scarfo's paranoia extended beyond the mob and into the businesses that fueled its revenue. Construction companies, labor unions, casino managers, all felt the weight of his gaze. He made it clear that mistakes would not be forgiven. A late payment was not just incompetence, it was disloyalty. A contract dispute was not negotiation, it was rebellion. This approach created efficiency of a kind. Money flowed. Deals were enforced. Few dared to cross him. But the cost was resentment. Businessmen who once cooperated out of mutual profit now complied out of fear, nursing a hatred that simmered beneath the surface. Scarfo didn't care. In fact, he preferred it. "Better they fear me than love me," he once told a close associate. Love fades. Fear doesn't. The family's uneasy quiet. Within his own organization, Scarfo's paranoia transformed daily life into a gauntlet. Capos who once enjoyed independence found themselves micromanaged. Soldiers who once confided in each other now withdrew into solitude. The very bonds that had held the mob together, loyalty, friendship, shared history, were eroded by constant suspicion. It worked for a while. Scarfo's men were too frightened to betray him. They obeyed, they paid their tributes, they executed his orders without hesitation. But beneath that obedience grew a dangerous truth. They obeyed not because they respected him, but because they feared him. And fear is brittle. It does not bind, it breaks. The shadow over Philadelphia. Ordinary Philadelphians too felt the shift. The city's underworld no longer hummed with the rough camaraderie of earlier years. It vibrated with tension. Union workers whispered that strikes might lead to more than lost paychecks. Restaurant owners double-checked their envelopes before handing them over. Even politicians who had long balanced deals with mob figures carried themselves more cautiously. Scarfo's paranoia infected the city like a fever. Philadelphia became a place where the safest bet was silence, where laughter felt dangerous, where the air itself seemed heavy with suspicion. And yet, Scarfo thrived in that atmosphere. To him, it was proof that his philosophy worked. If the whole city was uneasy, then no one would dare move against him. If no one trusted anyone, then betrayal would always reveal itself too late to matter. Scarfo once told a gathering of his closest men, "A man who sleeps easy is already dead. We don't sleep easy. That's why we're alive." For Philadelphia, though, it meant nights of unease, a city that mirrored the mind of its most paranoid ruler. The year was 1983 and Philadelphia had grown weary. But weariness did not mean relief. Under Nicodemo, little Nicky Scarfo, the city lived in the kind of tension that never snapped, it only tightened. Every week seemed to carry a new story whispered in bars, a new rumor murmured in diners. A man who went missing, a business that suddenly changed ownership, a union leader who resigned overnight. Scarfo's paranoia had become a system, and that system left no one untouched. Striking before the betrayal. Scarfo's philosophy was simple. If you wait for betrayal to happen, you've already lost. So he acted first. There was the case of a soldier accused, not proven, merely accused, of speaking too freely to outsiders. Scarfo summoned him to a meeting. The man arrived, expecting explanation, maybe punishment, but not death. Yet by the end of the night he was gone. No trial, no debate. Just silence and a lesson for everyone else. Another story told of a union boss who tried to renegotiate terms on a construction project. To Scarfo this was not business, it was treachery. Days later the man's office was firebombed. He survived, but he never questioned Scarfo's terms again. These incidents spread fear faster than any speech could. Scarfo didn't need to shout. He didn't need to remind anyone who he was. The city itself carried his message. Family ties under strain. Even within his own bloodline, Scarfo's paranoia reigned. Cousins, nephews, in-laws, no one was immune. At dinners, conversations were stilted, eyes darting to Scarfo for approval. Family members described gatherings where laughter felt rehearsed, where every compliment carried the weight of suspicion. Scarfo's closest relatives sometimes benefited from his power, gaining positions or protection. But they also lived with the constant risk of his mistrust. One nephew later recalled, "It was like living next to a live wire. You never knew when it would spark." Scarfo believed blood was no shield against betrayal. If anything, it made betrayal more likely. And so he watched his kin the way he watched his capos, closely, warily, without mercy. The mob in a cage of fear. Within the organization, Scarfo's paranoia produced both discipline and decay. Men showed up on time, paid their dues, followed orders. But they did so with hollow eyes, their loyalty no deeper than their fear of the consequences. The meetings grew colder. Gone were the days when mobsters swapped jokes, shared drinks, basked in the warmth of brotherhood. Under Scarfo, the atmosphere was heavy, silent, suffocating. Soldiers avoided sitting too close to one another, afraid their proximity might be misread. Capos chose their words like men stepping through a minefield. One observer later said, "It was like being in church, but the god at the altar was fear." Philadelphia, a city on edge. The paranoia didn't stop with the mob. It seeped outward, staining the city itself. Union workers noticed the change first. Strikes ended quicker, grievances went unspoken. Small businesses no longer negotiated, they complied. The police, too, carried themselves with caution. Some feared Scarfo's reach, others feared his silence. Ordinary citizens might not have known his name, but they felt his shadow. They felt it in the way neighbors whispered instead of talking openly. They felt it in the sudden closures of bars, the unmarked cars idling at corners, the sense that Philadelphia no longer belonged to its people, but to something unseen and unsaid. The paranoia that defined Scarfo was no longer just his personal armor, it was the city's atmosphere. The cost of suspicion. But paranoia, like fire, consumes what it feeds on. Scarfo's constant suspicion meant he could never rest, never breathe without imagining danger. His health suffered. His temper sharpened. Associates noticed he became quicker to rage, slower to forgive. The same fear that kept him safe also kept him isolated. Men obeyed, but they plotted in silence. Relatives smiled at his table, but they dreamed of escape. Even Philadelphia itself seemed to bristle under his rule, waiting for a chance to breathe again. And yet, in 1983 and 1984, Scarfo was untouchable. No one dared to move against him. He was small, but he loomed large. He was quiet, but his silence roared. He was suspicious, but in that suspicion lay his strength. Nicodemo, little Nicky, Scarfo had turned paranoia into power. But like all forms of power, it carried a cost he had yet to pay. By 1984, Philadelphia was exhausted. The years of silence, of walking on eggshells, of living beneath Scarfo's suffocating suspicion had hollowed the city out. His men still obeyed, his businesses still paid, his enemies still hesitated, but something beneath the surface had shifted. Fear had carried Scarfo to power. Now it began to work against him. A boss surrounded by shadows. Scarfo's rule had always been rooted in watching others. But the longer he reigned, the more his gaze turned inward. He began to suspect not just rivals, not just associates, but those closest to him, men who had built their lives on his orders, men who had bled at his command. A capo who hesitated at a meeting was seen as plotting. A nephew who arrived late to dinner was suspected of betrayal. Even compliments were dissected, twisted into hidden meanings. Scarfo's paranoia had always been sharp. By 1984 it was consuming. His men noticed the change. One later said, "Before, you were scared to make a mistake. Now you were scared just to breathe wrong around him." Violence without cause. As paranoia deepened, Scarfo's violence became more erratic. In one instance he ordered the execution of a soldier over rumors, unproven whispers, that the man had spoken to federal agents. No evidence was ever produced. The soldier simply vanished. Another time, a longtime associate was beaten nearly to death for questioning the timing of a payment. To Scarfo it wasn't a question, it was disloyalty. These incidents spread fear, but they also spread doubt. His men began to wonder, was Scarfo protecting the family, or was he destroying it from within? The fracturing of brotherhood. For decades, the mob's strength had been its sense of brotherhood. Men might fight, compete, even betray, but they shared a code, a loyalty to something greater than themselves. Scarfo's paranoia shattered that. Meetings no longer felt like gatherings of brothers. They felt like interrogations. Soldiers whispered less to each other, afraid their words would find their way back to Scarfo twisted. Capos who once conspired in shadows now avoided each other entirely, fearful of being accused of plotting. The family was still intact on the outside. But inside the bonds were fraying. Scarfo had turned his empire into a cage, and inside that cage men were beginning to suffocate. The city responds. Philadelphia too began to show signs of resistance. Business owners complied, but bitterness grew. Union leaders yielded, but quietly sought allies outside the mob. Politicians, once willing partners, began to distance themselves. Even ordinary citizens sensed the change. The fear that once silenced them now bred anger. They resented living under a shadow, resented the way their city felt hijacked by one man's paranoia. And for law enforcement, Scarfo's tightening grip was both a challenge and an opportunity. The very suspicion that made him effective also made him vulnerable. His men, tired of living under constant scrutiny, began to consider alternatives. The FBI and state police, sensing cracks in the armor, moved closer. A kingdom of fear, a throne of glass. By 1985, Scarfo was at once stronger than ever and weaker than ever. His paranoia had kept him alive, but it had also left him alone. His throne was intact, but it was made of glass. Every blow he struck to protect it sent new cracks racing across its surface. He ruled still, yes. Men still bowed their heads. Businesses still paid. But beneath it all, resentment, doubt, and quiet rebellion grew. And Scarfo, for all his suspicion, seemed blind to the truth. Fear can control, but it cannot sustain. Philadelphia's most paranoid don was entering the most dangerous phase of his reign. Not the rise, not the peak, but the slow unraveling of power that comes when a man's greatest strength becomes his greatest weakness. By mid-1984, Nicodemo, Little Nicky, Scarfo had reshaped Philadelphia's mob in his own image. Tense, silent, suspicious. But what he failed to see, or refused to admit, was that such an image could not last. The more tightly he held his empire, the more it fractured beneath his grip. Purges without end. Scarfo's paranoia had always driven his decisions, but by now it consumed them entirely. Whispers of betrayal were enough to justify executions. A soldier named Vincent, loyal for years, was suddenly accused of speaking too warmly with outsiders. There was no proof. But Scarfo didn't need proof, he needed certainty. Vincent was gone within the week. Another capo, seasoned and respected, made the mistake of pausing too long before answering a question in a meeting. Scarfo's gaze lingered, suspicion hardened, and within days the capo was stripped of his position. Not executed, but humiliated, his reputation shattered. For the mob, humiliation could be worse than death. These purges spread terror. But terror did not inspire loyalty. It inspired silence, resentment, and, eventually, treachery. Families in the crossfire. Scarfo's suspicion reached beyond the men themselves and into their families. One nephew complained about the endless demands placed upon him, and Scarfo's response was chilling. You don't complain. You obey. Or you leave. But in Scarfo's world, leaving wasn't an option. Those who tried often ended up missing, their absence explained with vague shrugs. Wives whispered among themselves, fearful that their husbands might be next. Children grew up knowing that a single mistake at a dinner table, a laugh too loud, a glance too long, could mark their father for suspicion. Scarfo believed paranoia protected him. In truth, it was poisoning everything it touched. The watchers become watched. Law enforcement had struggled against Scarfo's secrecy for years. But by 1984, they noticed the cracks forming. Wiretaps picked up grumbles from associates, half-muttered complaints that revealed exhaustion and doubt. Informants, once terrified of Scarfo's reach, began to consider talking. The FBI realized that Scarfo's paranoia was both his armor and his weakness. The more he suspected his men, the more isolated he became. The more isolated he became, the easier it was for agents to slip into the gaps, offering frightened soldiers the one thing Scarfo could never provide: protection. One agent later described it this way: Scarfo didn't need us to break his family. He was doing it himself. All we had to do was wait. Philadelphia boils. The city itself reflected Scarfo's unraveling. Union meetings became tense, deals slower, businesses less cooperative. Ordinary citizens, long silent under fear, began to resist in subtle ways: delays in payments, quiet refusals to cooperate, whispers passed along to police. For decades, Philadelphia had lived with mob influence as an unspoken fact of life. But under Scarfo the relationship had soured. Fear no longer ensured compliance, it bred rebellion. Even politicians who once struck quiet bargains with mob figures began to back away. Scarfo's unpredictability made him a liability. And in the halls of government, the tide was shifting. More resources were being funneled into organized crime investigations, more eyes fixed on Philadelphia's paranoid don. The isolation of a king. By late 1984, Scarfo's kingdom looked strong from the outside. Money flowed, men obeyed, enemies hesitated. But inside he was alone. Every ally was a suspect. Every smile was a disguise. Every silence was a conspiracy. He had built his reign on fear, but fear cannot build trust. And without trust, even the strongest empire stands on hollow ground. Scarfo, small in stature but immense in suspicion, had turned Philadelphia into a reflection of his own mind. And like any mirror cracked too many times, the reflection was beginning to shatter. By 1985, the cracks in Scarfo's empire were no longer invisible. They were spreading like fractures in glass, thin at first but deepening with each new blow. And with every decision he made, Scarfo's paranoia widened them. A year of blood and silence. The year opened with violence. Scarfo, convinced that disloyalty lurked in every shadow, escalated his purges. Soldiers who once walked proudly under his banner now walked nervously, eyes darting, voices low. One particularly brutal incident involved a man named Salvi Testa, once considered a golden boy in the family. Smart, respected, and charismatic, Testa represented the future. But to Scarfo such qualities were dangerous. Charisma meant influence. Influence meant independence. And independence, in Scarfo's mind, meant betrayal waiting to happen. Despite Testa's loyalty, Scarfo grew suspicious. He ordered the young capo's execution. The news sent shockwaves through Philadelphia. If even Testa, admired, promising, seemingly untouchable, could be struck down, then no one was safe. Scarfo thought this would cement his rule. Instead, it revealed the rot within. The turning of the tide. Among his men, fear hardened into bitterness. Soldiers whispered of leaving, capos dreamed of alliances elsewhere, nephews and cousins contemplated escape. But leaving Scarfo's world was dangerous, sometimes more dangerous than staying. The FBI and local authorities seized the moment. They doubled down on surveillance, quietly recruiting informants. For the first time in years, men inside the mob began to talk. They weren't motivated by justice or loyalty to the law. They were motivated by survival from Scarfo himself. Agents noticed a pattern. The more Scarfo punished imagined betrayals, the more real betrayals multiplied. His paranoia had become prophecy, self-fulfilling and unstoppable. A city on the brink. Philadelphia itself reflected Scarfo's unraveling state. Businesses resented the endless demands. Unions bent under his pressure, but cracks formed in their ranks. Ordinary people whispered not just in fear but in anger. The newspapers began to report more boldly on mob violence, splashing names and faces across headlines. Politicians, sensing public outrage, leaned harder into promises of reform and tougher crackdowns. The aura of untouchability that Scarfo once enjoyed was dimming. The city, long trapped in his web of suspicion, began to resist, quietly at first, then louder. Scarfo's paranoia, once the invisible hand guiding Philadelphia's nights, had become visible, heavy, oppressive. The isolation of power. By late 1985, Scarfo was alone in all but appearance. At meetings, men still nodded. At dinners, they still smiled. But their eyes betrayed exhaustion. Their hearts carried rebellion. Scarfo, however, saw only enemies. He ate with his pistol at his side. He spoke in clipped sentences. He dismissed laughter as a cover for plotting. His world, already small, shrank further until it contained only suspicion and silence. Nicodemo, little Nicky, Scarfo had turned paranoia into an empire. But now, that same paranoia had turned the empire against him. He remained boss. He remained feared. But the cracks in his reign had spread too far, too deep. And though the glass throne still stood, it trembled with every breath, every whisper, every unspoken thought of rebellion. The dawn of suspicion was discovering the cruelest truth of all. Fear can make men obey, but it cannot make them believe. Thus ended the early years of Scarfo's reign, not in collapse, not yet, but in fracture. The Philadelphia mob still bowed to him. The city still whispered his name with dread. But beneath that dread lived doubt, resentment, and quiet defiance. The cracks had appeared. And once cracks appear, they do not close. They spread. For Scarfo, the most paranoid Don Philadelphia had ever seen, the real enemy was no longer just betrayal from others. The real enemy was himself. The blinds were always drawn. At Scarfo's Atlantic City condo, daylight rarely touched the walls. Curtains hung heavy, shutting out the boardwalk's glitter, the casino's neon glow, the ocean's shifting light. Inside, the air was dim, thick with cigarette smoke and silence. Those who entered said it felt less like a home and more like a bunker. This was how Nicodemo, little Nicky Scarfo, lived. Not in the bright, noisy chaos of the city he ruled, but in the muted shadows of rooms sealed tight against the world. A house that never slept. Scarfo's life behind closed blinds was an extension of his paranoia. He rarely slept through the night. Associates recalled visits at odd hours, 3 in the morning for before dawn, when Scarfo was already awake, already pacing, already brooding over imagined threats. A gun always lay within arm's reach. Sometimes on the nightstand, sometimes on the kitchen table, sometimes resting casually beside his plate at dinner. It wasn't for show. It was ritual. Scarfo trusted steel more than he trusted flesh. Neighbors noticed odd patterns. Curtains never opened. Lights flickered at strange hours. Cars pulled in and out quickly, never lingering. To outsiders, it seemed like a man hiding from enemies. To Scarfo, it was survival. Meals in silence. Dinners in Scarfo's home were infamous among his family. There was no warmth, no laughter, no casual conversation. Plates were set, food served, but words were measured like currency. One nephew later described it: "You sat at his table, you ate carefully, you answered when spoken to. You didn't joke. You didn't relax. You felt like every bite might be your last if you said the wrong thing." Scarfo's eyes moved constantly, scanning faces, weighing pauses, reading tones. Even compliments, "The meal's good tonight," were met with suspicion. Was it genuine? Was it sarcasm? Was it an attempt to mask unease? In Scarfo's world, nothing was ever simple. Rituals of fear. Paranoia shaped his daily rituals. He checked locks himself, no matter how many times others assured him. He refused to sit with his back to a window or door. He demanded blinds remain shut, even on bright afternoons when the boardwalk buzzed just beyond the glass. He trusted no phones. Conversations were kept face-to-face, voices low, words clipped. He distrusted notes, papers, anything that might linger after the moment. He preferred memory, his own and no one else's. Even his clothing reflected the pattern. Suits pressed sharp, ties neat, shoes polished. To Scarfo, presentation was armor. A wrinkle, a loose thread, an untidy appearance might be read as weakness, and weakness in his mind was an invitation for betrayal. Family in a cage. Scarfo's family lived in the same cage of suspicion. Wives learned not to ask questions. Children grew up in silence, their laughter hushed, their innocence dulled by the constant weight of eyes watching. One relative remembered being told never to bring friends over, never to speak openly about family matters, never to assume safety even inside the walls of their own home. Scarfo's paranoia had turned private life into a prison. Blood offered no immunity. If anything, Scarfo seemed harsher with relatives. Perhaps because betrayal from blood cut deeper. Perhaps because he believed loyalty should come most naturally from family, and so any hesitation, any mistake was doubly damning. The city reflecting its dawn. Philadelphia, meanwhile, mirrored Scarfo's private world. The city itself seemed to live behind closed blinds. Bars grew quieter, unions more subdued, businesses less bold. The same silence that filled Scarfo's home filled the streets, as if the entire city had absorbed his paranoia. Shutters closed earlier. Neighbors spoke less. Whispers traveled in careful circles. Even laughter, once common at street corners and stoops, felt rare, replaced by glances over shoulders and lowered voices. Scarfo's mindset had become Philadelphia's atmosphere. The illusion of control. Behind those blinds, Scarfo believed he was safe. He believed he was in control. Every ritual, every silence, every shuttered window reinforced the illusion that he could outlast betrayal by anticipating it. But outside those blinds, the world shifted. The FBI gathered evidence. Discontent simmered among his men. Families whispered of rebellion. The very silence Scarfo demanded became fertile ground for conspiracies he couldn't see. And so, while Scarfo lived in his bunker, convinced he was untouchable, the walls around him were slowly, quietly closing in. The deeper Scarfo withdrew into his world of shuttered windows and whispered conversations, the more the city outside seemed to take on his shape. Philadelphia was no longer just a city under mob influence. It was a city infected by one man's paranoia. Nights of unease. Scarfo's nights were infamous. Associates invited to his condo described a routine that bordered on ritualistic obsession. Before any business was discussed, Scarfo would walk the perimeter, checking doors, locks, blinds. Even if he had checked them minutes earlier, he would check again. Conversations started only after these rituals. And they were never relaxed. Scarfo spoke in short sentences, his eyes never resting on one person for long. A pause too long, a glance exchanged between visitors. Such things could derail the entire meeting, his suspicion flooding the room until business ground to a halt. One soldier recalled, "It felt like he was waiting for me to trip. Waiting for one wrong word. It was like doing business in a confessional where every word could damn you." The family's quiet terror. Inside his family, the atmosphere was no different. Scarfo's wife and children lived as though they too were suspects. Dinner tables were places of inspection. Vacations were rare, and when they occurred, they were spent in guarded isolation. Scarfo's children were taught early not to trust outsiders. Not teachers, not friends, not even extended relatives. One son once brought home a schoolmate without warning. The boy was polite, harmless, but Scarfo's fury was volcanic. "We don't invite strangers into this house," he hissed, his anger chilling the room. The boy never returned, and the son never forgot the lesson. Love existed in a way, but it was love suffocated by suspicion. Scarfo cared for his family, but always through the lens of fear. Fear that someone might use them, fear that they might betray him unintentionally, fear that even blood was not beyond corruption. A mob without laughter. For his men, Scarfo's paranoia created a culture of silence so deep it became corrosive. The backrooms where mobsters once laughed, gambled, and swapped stories now felt like funeral parlors. No one spoke freely. Jokes were rare, and when they came they fell flat, the laughter forced. Capos who once enjoyed independence now walked carefully, knowing Scarfo's eyes were everywhere. Soldiers who once trusted each other now avoided even the appearance of friendship. Any bond too close, any alliance too visible, could be read as conspiracy. What had once been a brotherhood was now a collection of isolated men, each living in his own shadow. Scarfo ruled them all, but he ruled a family stripped of its soul. The city mirrors its dawn. Philadelphia mirrored this transformation. Businesses that had once thrived under the mob's shadow began to wither under its weight. Shopkeepers paid, yes, but they paid with bitterness. Union leaders complied, but their loyalty was a facade. Even politicians, once eager for quiet arrangements, began to treat Scarfo with distance. Ordinary people noticed too. They saw the fear in their neighborhoods, the way laughter disappeared, the way conversations cut short when a black sedan idled nearby. Philadelphia was a city alive on the surface, but underneath, it pulsed with unease, restless, distrustful, sleepless. It was as though Scarfo's paranoia had expanded beyond his walls, beyond his family, beyond his organization, and seeped into the very bricks of the city. Cracks in the fortress. Yet behind those blinds, Scarfo believed he was secure. He believed that by sealing himself off, by trusting no one, he had made himself untouchable. What he could not see was that the silence he enforced was not proof of loyalty, it was proof of fear. And fear, while powerful, is brittle. It can hold a structure upright, but once it begins to crack, the collapse is sudden and violent. By 1986, whispers of discontent grew louder. Men spoke to federal agents in secret. Families, suffocating under the weight of constant suspicion, looked for exits. Politicians turned their backs. And Philadelphia itself seemed poised for change. Scarfo still lived behind his blinds, convinced that vigilance would save him. But the truth was simpler and crueler. He was already trapped. His walls, his blinds, his locks, they didn't just keep enemies out. They kept him in. By 1986, the world outside Scarfo's windows had changed. The casinos still glittered, the boardwalk still buzzed, but none of that light pierced the drawn blinds of his Atlantic City condo. Inside, Scarfo's world grew darker by the day. A life of constant vigil. His daily routines became more rigid, more obsessive. He no longer trusted anyone else to secure the house. Associates said he would circle the condo like a sentry, locking and relocking doors, tugging at blinds, checking corners as if ghosts might lurk there. Phone calls were brief, clipped, suspicious. He distrusted every voice on the other end of the line, even when it belonged to men he had known for decades. Meetings were pared down to essentials, and even then, Scarfo preferred them face-to-face, in rooms he believed he could control. But control, like trust, was an illusion. The family fractures. His paranoia reached a fever pitch within his family. Relatives lived like tenants in a house they could never leave. Children's laughter was silenced, wives moved carefully, words weighed heavily before being spoken. One story circulated among kin. Scarfo overheard two relatives whispering about vacation plans. The subject was innocent, but Scarfo's mind twisted it into conspiracy. He exploded, accusing them of plotting behind his back. The incident ended in days of icy silence, the family too frightened to speak at all. Scarfo demanded loyalty, but the price of that loyalty was suffocating fear. And fear corrodes love faster than betrayal ever could. The organization under siege. For his men, 1986 was the year paranoia became unbearable. Soldiers walked on eggshells. Capos held their breath in meetings. Even those closest to Scarfo admitted privately that they no longer knew how to please him. Any gesture, any pause, any slip of the tongue could be misread as treachery. The culture of silence, once his greatest weapon, had now turned inward. It strangled initiative, smothered ambition, and froze the organization in place. The Philadelphia mob wasn't thriving under Scarfo. It was surviving, and barely. Law enforcement, watching closely, recognized the opportunity. They knew fear alone could not hold men forever. And so, behind Scarfo's blinds, while he believed he had locked the world out, the FBI was slipping in through the cracks, through informants, through recordings, through the growing bitterness of men desperate for a way out. Philadelphia's restless pulse. Beyond Scarfo's circle, the city stirred. Philadelphia had lived in fear for years, but fear without relief breeds restlessness. Businesses grumbled, unions resisted in quiet ways, and politicians no longer offered their usual cover. The press reported more boldly, emboldened by whispers that Scarfo's control was weakening. It was as though the entire city had taken on the rhythm of his condo, drawn blinds, hushed voices, endless tension. But now the pressure was too great. Something had to break. A prison of his own making. Scarfo believed his rituals protected him. The blinds, the locks, the silence, they were armor against betrayal. But in truth they were bars of a cage he had built around himself. He lived in fear not only of enemies but of shadows, of whispers, of silence itself. His empire had become an extension of his paranoia, strong on the outside, hollow within. And so, in 1986, while Scarfo still ruled Philadelphia's underworld, he did so from behind walls that no longer protected him. They confined him. They reflected him. And they foretold the collapse that was already coming. Scarfo's blinds remained closed, his doors locked, his pistol always near. But for all his vigilance, he could not see the truth. The real danger was no longer outside those walls. It was inside his family, his organization, his city, and most of all, inside himself. The Don who built an empire from suspicion now found himself trapped in suspicion's prison. And beyond those blinds, Philadelphia waited, restless and ready, for the moment when the silence would finally shatter. Philadelphia in the mid-1980s was not just a city of neighborhoods, parishes, and ballparks. It was a city built on contracts. Concrete poured into highways, steel beams rose into towers, and beneath every project, every crane, every union hall, the shadow of Scarfo lingered. Scarfo understood something that few mobsters before him had grasped fully. Violence alone could not sustain power. Money had to flow. And in a city where every dollar of construction passed through union hands, the unions became his machine. The union grip. Scarfo's control of the labor unions was not subtle. Leaders who resisted were intimidated, sometimes beaten, occasionally killed. Those who cooperated were rewarded with contracts, jobs for friends, envelopes of cash. To the outside world, the unions looked like organizations of working men. But in Scarfo's Philadelphia, they were pipelines. Every paycheck skimmed. Every benefit fund siphoned. Every contract inflated. Money flowed upward, silent and steady, until it reached Scarfo's pocket. Yet this grip was not just financial. It was psychological. Workers knew that to cross the union was to cross Scarfo himself. A missed payment, a whispered complaint, a refusal to cooperate, such things did not end in arbitration. They ended in fear, in broken windows, and sudden disappearances. The casino connection. Atlantic City's casinos, glittering monuments to fortune and chance, became Scarfo's other great engine. He had been involved since the early days of legalization, and now his paranoia proved useful. No dollar went uncounted. No deal escaped scrutiny. But paranoia also meant no trust. Casino managers, contractors, even pit bosses lived under constant suspicion. Every partnership was a trap waiting to spring. Scarfo demanded tribute from all of them, but he also demanded their fear. Tourists strolling the boardwalk never saw it. They saw neon lights and roulette wheels. But behind the scenes, every card turned, every die cast, every machine spun under Scarfo's shadow. The construction web. Construction was the backbone of Scarfo's empire. Skyscrapers, highways, stadiums, all bore invisible costs. Contractors paid for safety. Developers paid for progress. Even the city itself, awarding public projects, found its funds siphoned by Scarfo's machine. Scarfo's men did not simply take money, they controlled the pace of progress. A project that paid ran smoothly. A project that resisted stalled under labor disputes, strikes orchestrated from Scarfo's hand. Concrete trucks sat idle. Workers walked off sites. Deadlines stretched. And eventually payments appeared. This was Scarfo's genius. He didn't just rule people. He ruled time itself. He made businessmen wait, made developers sweat, made politicians beg. And in a world where time was money, Scarfo profited from both. The price of expansion. But expansion came at a cost. The more Scarfo tightened his grip, the more enemies he made. Businessmen hated him. Politicians resented him. Union members, forced into silence, grumbled in private. Even within the mob, resentment grew. Other families watched as Scarfo siphoned millions. They tolerated his rise when he was a useful enforcer. But now, as boss, his paranoia and greed alienated allies. The Gambinos in New York, the Genoveses in Jersey, they all dealt with Scarfo cautiously, reluctantly, their smiles thin, their patience thinner. He was making money, yes. But he was also making enemies. A machine built on fear. Philadelphia streets reflected this duality. On one hand, Scarfo's machine was efficient. Projects got built. Money moved. The mob, under his rule, was more financially entrenched than ever. On the other hand, the city suffocated. Workers labored not with pride but with fear. Contractors built not for profit but for survival. Casinos glittered not with joy but with unease. Scarfo called it control. Others called it a shakedown. But whatever the name, it was the same machine. One man's paranoia made flesh, grinding through concrete, steel, and souls. Philadelphia's skyline in the mid-1980s told one story: progress. Cranes cut across the horizon, highways expanded, and construction sites buzzed with the sound of drills and hammers. But underneath that noise was another rhythm, quieter, darker, the rhythm of Scarfo's machine. Union blood. One incident etched itself into memory among construction workers. A foreman, tired of constant extra fees demanded by the union, decided to cut corners. He delayed a payment, hoping to negotiate a better deal later. Scarfo found out. The man's truck exploded in a South Philly alley one morning, flames rising high enough to draw a crowd. The foreman survived, but the message was unmistakable. There was no negotiating with Scarfo. After that, payments came in on time. Always. The unions, outwardly democratic, had become Scarfo's enforcement arm. Votes meant nothing, contracts were theater. What mattered was obedience. What mattered was fear. Concrete deals and silent partners. Contractors working on public projects soon learned Scarfo's rules. If they paid quietly, their projects ran smoothly. If they resisted, accidents happened. Deliveries were delayed, strikes erupted overnight, machinery broke down mysteriously. One developer, a respected man in Center City, tried to bypass Scarfo's network. His project, an office tower, fell weeks behind schedule. Concrete trucks failed to arrive, workers walked off the job, inspectors suddenly flagged violations. Under pressure from investors, the developer relented. He made a single call to one of Scarfo's men, arranged a meeting and signed an agreement. The very next morning the strikes ended, trucks rolled in, inspectors looked the other way. Scarfo didn't just control the unions. He controlled inevitability. The business backlash. But resentment simmered. Businessmen who once accepted mob taxes as the cost of doing business now saw them balloon under Scarfo's paranoia. He demanded more, trusted less, punished harder. Whispers spread in boardrooms: he's not like the others. He doesn't want a deal. He wants everything. Some businessmen began documenting their experiences quietly, slipping information to federal agents. They weren't driven by morality, they were driven by exhaustion. Scarfo's demands felt endless, his suspicion insatiable. Strained mafia alliances. Beyond Philadelphia, Scarfo's behavior grated on the 5 families of New York. The Gambinos, the Genoveses, they dealt with unions and casinos too, and they knew cooperation kept profits steady. Scarfo, however, was different. His paranoia made him unpredictable. At sit-downs he came across as tense, irritable, unwilling to compromise. New York bosses left meetings frustrated, muttering that Scarfo was too small to be this greedy. To them he was an irritant, useful at times, dangerous at others, but never trustworthy. Scarfo didn't care. Trust wasn't in his vocabulary. But in the world of organized crime, alienating New York was a dangerous game. The weight of the machine. Scarfo's empire churned on. Money poured in. Buildings rose. Casinos glittered. Unions marched to his tune. On the surface, it was power unmatched. But beneath that surface, resentment piled like sandbags against a dam. Businessmen hated him. Workers feared him. Politicians avoided him. Other families distrusted him. Even his own men, worn down by constant suspicion, began to wonder how long this machine could run before it collapsed under its own weight. Skimming the casinos. Atlantic City in the mid-1980s glittered like a promise. Tourists lined the boardwalk, spilling into casinos where bells rang, cards flipped, and fortunes shifted on the turn of a wheel. But behind that spectacle, Scarfo's men quietly turned luck into certainty. The skimming was simple in concept, brutal in execution. Small percentages shaved from cash flows, envelopes carried out of back offices, numbers adjusted before they ever reached the books. To the tourists, nothing changed. To the casinos, it was just the cost of doing business. To Scarfo, it was a river of money flowing straight into his machine. But paranoia demanded more than profit. Managers were monitored. Pit bosses were questioned. Dealers were shuffled if they became too familiar. Every layer of the casino was touched by Scarfo's suspicion. It made the skimming efficient, but also fragile. Too many eyes, too much fear, and eventually cracks began to show. Money laundered in fear. The cash from casinos and construction didn't just sit in envelopes. It moved through restaurants, bars, trucking companies, real estate. On paper, these businesses looked legitimate. In reality, they were arteries in Scarfo's circulatory system, pumping dirty money into clean accounts. But again, paranoia crept in. Scarfo changed couriers often, shuffled managers, rotated responsibilities so no single man ever held too much knowledge. To him, compartmentalization was safety. To his men, it was chaos. They never knew how long they'd last in a position, never knew if being trusted today meant being suspected tomorrow. The system worked, for a while. But like everything built on fear, it wore thin. Mistakes multiplied. Workers grew sloppy under stress. And every mistake was another opening for federal agents already circling like vultures. The public begins to see. Philadelphia's citizens, long accustomed to mob whispers, began to feel Scarfo's presence more directly. Delayed projects, inflated contracts, strikes timed too neatly to be coincidence, all pointed to the same invisible hand. The press grew bolder. Headlines linked construction delays to underworld influence. Investigative reporters dug into union records, exposing sudden shifts in leadership, unexplained financial holes. Scarfo's name appeared in print more often, his shadow harder to ignore. For ordinary Philadelphians, the mob had always been background noise, something tolerated, half acknowledged. Under Scarfo, it became suffocating. Everyday life, jobs, bills, taxes, seemed warped by the paranoia of one man pulling strings. Law enforcement tightens the net. The FBI, state police, and federal prosecutors recognized opportunity. Scarfo's machine was massive, but it was also messy. Every layer of control meant more moving parts, more chances for informants to slip in. Wiretaps captured grumbling union men. Businessmen, fed up with endless payments, quietly spoke to investigators. Casino employees, nervous about their futures, whispered about skimming operations. Each complaint, each whisper, each tape added weight to the growing case file. Scarfo still believed his blinds kept danger out. In truth, the danger was already inside his machine, bleeding information into the hands of men determined to bring him down. A city strangled by its own progress. Philadelphia's skyline rose higher. Casinos glowed brighter. Money flowed faster. But beneath the surface, resentment, suspicion, and investigation grew. Scarfo had built a machine that touched every corner of the city: unions, casinos, construction, business, politics. It was vast, powerful, and lucrative. But it was also brittle, held together not by loyalty or respect, but by fear. And fear, once stretched too thin, always tears. Philadelphia in 1986 was a city held hostage by fear. The streets whispered Scarfo's name, and the boardwalk in Atlantic City glittered, oblivious to the tension under the neon lights. The empire he had built, fueled by paranoia, unions, casinos, and construction contracts, was still intact, but its foundation had begun to fracture. Nicodemo, little Nicky, Scarfo was not a man accustomed to compromise. Every move was calculated, every glance measured, every loyalty tested. But the very men who had been molded by fear began to see cracks in the armor. They whispered in private, took notes, and slowly, carefully, they reached toward the only thing that could save them: law enforcement. The first signs of betrayal. It began with small acts. A soldier who had been a loyal enforcer delayed a payment. A capo complained quietly about Scarfo's constant interference. A manager in Atlantic City expressed doubt over a skimming operation. None of these acts would have mattered in previous years. Scarfo would have squashed them quietly, efficiently. But now, fatigue, resentment, and fear were combining in dangerous ways. Each misstep, each hesitation, each murmur became magnified. Scarfo's paranoia, once a tool, was now an amplifier of instability. FBI agents who had long struggled to infiltrate the family noticed these small fractures. They approached low-level soldiers carefully, offering protection in exchange for information. Fear, it seemed, could be converted into survival, and survival was often worth betrayal. A family tense and fractured. Scarfo's paranoia had already reshaped his immediate family's behavior. But now, even they began to question his decisions. Relatives who had once moved like shadows inside his home now considered subtle rebellion, small acts of defiance that were almost invisible. One nephew secretly passed information about union skimming to federal agents. A cousin hesitated to deliver envelopes, fearing the consequences of a misstep. Scarfo noticed their nervousness but could not pinpoint the source. His paranoia, though sharp, was becoming a double-edged sword. Every suspicion was magnified, but it was impossible to act against invisible enemies without endangering loyal men. The FBI tightens the net. Federal investigators saw opportunity in Scarfo's paranoia. Every man living in fear was a potential witness. Every whispered complaint could be nurtured into testimony. By 1986, wiretaps captured more incriminating conversations than ever. Associates, once terrified of Scarfo's retribution, began to negotiate deals for immunity in exchange for their cooperation. The net began to tighten. The more Scarfo enforced his rules through fear, the more isolated his men became, and the more likely they were to turn. It was a paradox. His paranoia had created the very conditions that would allow his enemies to penetrate the empire he had fought so long to construct. Tensions in Atlantic City. Atlantic City remained lucrative but tense. Casinos and contractors, aware of Scarfo's reach and the growing federal interest, began behaving cautiously. Managers shuffled numbers, employees reported suspicious activity to authorities, and whispers of federal investigations became commonplace in back offices. Scarfo, unaware of the growing internal resistance, continued to demand absolute loyalty. Delays were punished, mistakes were punished, hesitation was punished. Yet every act of discipline, every show of power, pushed his men closer to betrayal. The weight of control. Scarfo's days became a treadmill of suspicion. Every new contract, every union meeting, every casino skim required vigilance. Every hour spent overseeing operations left less time to monitor human hearts. He could not trust his men, yet he depended on them for everything. He could not relax, yet he needed them to function. Philadelphia itself mirrored this tension. Streets were quiet but charged. Businesses operated efficiently but under duress. The city thrummed with the same fear that Scarfo cultivated within his empire, but that fear was now as much a threat to him as it was to anyone else. Scarfo's paranoia, once a weapon, was transforming into a trap. Every act of control added to the pressure. Every threat increased the chance of rebellion. He had created an empire that functioned through fear, but fear alone could not sustain it. By 1986, whispers of rebellion were no longer confined to the shadows. The men who had once obeyed Scarfo's every command now conspired in silence, calculating when and how to protect themselves. Paranoia, the very tool Scarfo had wielded to build his empire, was now turning his men into reluctant conspirators. Capo's turn. Anthony Tony DeLuca had been Scarfo's right-hand man for years. Loyal, disciplined, seemingly fearless, he had navigated the treacherous streets of Philadelphia without incident. But even Tony could not withstand the relentless fear Scarfo imposed. It began with small acts of defiance, delays in reporting skimming totals, brief absences from Atlantic City meetings, whispered complaints about arbitrary punishments. These minor transgressions to Scarfo were signals of treachery. To Tony they were survival instincts. By mid-1986, Tony had begun secretly cooperating with federal agents. He provided details on union skimming, construction bribery, and casino operations. He knew the risks. He knew that discovery meant death. But the constant tension, the paranoia, the impossibility of ever pleasing Scarfo left him no choice. Survival was worth betrayal. Other capos followed similar paths. Each man, pushed to the brink by Scarfo's suspicion, found solace in quietly trading information for protection. Fear, which had once held the family together, now unraveled it. Soldiers in the shadows. The rank-and-file soldiers, too, were reaching their breaking points. Living under constant observation, knowing any mistake could end their lives, many began to approach law enforcement. One soldier, a young man named Frankie, had served Scarfo for 5 years. He witnessed beatings, disappearances, and extreme punishments over imagined slights. When approached by FBI agents offering protection and a chance to testify against Scarfo, he hesitated only briefly before agreeing. By late 1986, a network of informants had begun to form within Scarfo's own ranks. Men who once feared death above all else now feared Scarfo's empire more than the law. The FBI's moves. Federal agents were methodical. They set traps and recorded conversations, waited patiently, and cultivated relationships with those inside Scarfo's world. Each informant provided small, seemingly inconsequential pieces of information. A misfiled ledger here, a whispered complaint there, details about who controlled which union contract. Over time, these pieces formed a comprehensive picture of Scarfo's operations. The FBI recognized the irony. Scarfo's obsession with secrecy and surveillance had inadvertently created a wealth of exploitable data. Every fear-driven decision, every act of paranoia, made the empire more vulnerable. The isolation grows. Scarfo, meanwhile, remained convinced of his omnipotence. He tightened his grip further, demanding more from his men, scrutinizing every move. He distrusted everyone, including those who had once proven their loyalty. This hypervigilance had consequences. Men stopped speaking to one another, family members withdrew, and Scarfo himself became increasingly isolated. His empire of fear, once an instrument of absolute control, was slowly turning against him. Philadelphia mirrored this tension. Contractors, union members, and business owners all sensed a shift. Scarfo's once efficient machine now creaked under the weight of internal dissent and external scrutiny. Even those who had once feared him most began to see cracks. Fear no longer inspired obedience, it inspired caution, resentment, and betrayal. By late 1986, the empire Scarfo had painstakingly built with fear and paranoia was beginning to crumble under its own weight. The unions, construction contracts, and casino skimming that had flowed smoothly for years now faced disruption from multiple fronts. Internal dissent, federal investigation, and public scrutiny. Collapsing operations. In Philadelphia's construction sector, contractors grew emboldened. Some delayed payments deliberately, hoping to pressure Scarfo's men, while others reported irregularities to federal agents. Scarfo's once efficient system of intimidation began to falter. Projects stalled, work crews became unreliable, and delays that had been unthinkable now became common. Casinos too felt the strain. Managers and pit bosses, under pressure from federal investigations, began quietly feeding information to investigators. Employees fearful of Scarfo's suspicion found an unexpected sense of protection from government programs and informant deals. Skimming operations slowed as agents infiltrated the network, forcing Scarfo to tighten his control even further, an action that only accelerated the paranoia spreading among his men. Betrayal within. The informants, once low-level soldiers and capos, became the linchpins of the FBI's case. Men who had been silenced by fear now spoke in hushed tones, passing along crucial details about payrolls, union manipulation, and money laundering. Scarfo's paranoia, which had once protected him, now blinded him to the danger within. Every man around him carried secrets, and every secret now held the potential to dismantle his empire. Meetings became exercises in futility, men nodded and whispered obedience, but behind Scarfo's back, alliances formed against him. Media and public pressure. Philadelphia's press began reporting more aggressively on mob activities. Investigative journalists exposed suspicious union contracts, unexplained business closures, and incidents linked to Scarfo's influence. Headlines portrayed a city suffocated by organized crime. For the first time, the citizens of Philadelphia openly discussed Scarfo's reign. Neighborhoods that had once whispered now debated and questioned. Business owners took cautious measures to protect themselves, some even providing information to federal authorities in exchange for security. The city itself, once Scarfo's silent partner, now actively resisted his control. The isolated dawn. Scarfo retreated further into his routines. The blinds in his Atlantic City condo were drawn tighter. Security measures multiplied. Meals became more private, shorter, and more scrutinized. Conversations were clipped. Associates spoke less. Family members walked on eggshells. But Scarfo could not see the invisible forces working against him. Federal investigators, informants, and a restless city were all converging. His paranoia, while constant, could not compensate for the breadth of betrayal and oversight closing in from every angle. The first legal shadows. By the end of 1986, Scarfo's empire was under formal legal scrutiny. The FBI had begun preparing indictments, informed by months of testimony from former soldiers and business collaborators. Union skimming cases, illegal casino operations, and evidence of extortion provided the framework for federal prosecutions. Scarfo's men, now fearful not only of him but of law enforcement, began negotiating plea deals. The very paranoia that had ensured loyalty now forced men to take independent steps to protect themselves. Scarfo's empire, built on fear, was unraveling not with a single strike, but through countless simultaneous fractures. Philadelphia had changed. The city that once bent under Scarfo's shadow was learning to stand again. And Scarfo, despite his vigilance, was increasingly aware that the walls he had built to protect himself were no longer sufficient. Philadelphia in 1987 had become a city perpetually looking over its shoulder. Scarfo's influence was still everywhere: union halls, construction sites, casinos, but the fear that once guaranteed obedience was now mirrored in every whisper, every glance, every hesitant movement. Nicodemo, little Nicky, Scarfo felt it first in his own ranks. Men who had once obeyed without question now approached their duties cautiously, calculating risk, measuring the possibility of survival against loyalty. The pressure intensifies. FBI investigations accelerated. Scarfo's paranoia, which had always been his shield, now amplified the perception of danger. He scrutinized every report, every memo, every call, believing enemies lurked not just outside but inside his organization. Meetings with capos were tense exercises in observation. Scarfo would sit silently for long stretches, observing gestures, noting pauses, cataloging glances. A cough too long, a hesitation in speech, even a look exchanged between two soldiers could provoke suspicion that often led to punishment. His men became shadows of themselves. Fear had stripped them of confidence. Loyalty was replaced by caution, obedience replaced by calculation. Scarfo's paranoia, once a tool of absolute control, now suffocated the very empire it had built. Betrayal from within. By mid-1987, multiple capos had begun cooperating with law enforcement. Each one carried information about skimming, extortion, union manipulation, and casino operations. One such capo, Anthony DeLuca, provided extensive details of money flows from Atlantic City back to Philadelphia. Another soldier revealed meetings where Scarfo had ordered punishments over perceived slights, offering insight into his internal operations. Scarfo's paranoia had made him blind to the fact that the men closest to him were already working against him. Fear had taught them to survive, and survival meant betrayal. External pressure. Meanwhile, the city itself was changing. Contractors no longer paid quietly. Some used the courts to challenge union interference. Journalists were emboldened, publishing exposés linking Scarfo's empire to widespread corruption. Politicians, feeling the pressure from constituents and law enforcement, began scrutinizing the operations that had once been quietly tolerated. Even Atlantic City felt the tension. Casinos monitored cash flows more closely, auditors doubled their efforts, and whispers of federal scrutiny spread among employees. Scarfo's once hidden operations were slowly being illuminated, his empire exposed to forces it had never confronted before. The isolation deepens. Scarfo retreated further behind his blinds, both physically and psychologically. Meals became shorter, conversations clipped, and associates were kept at a distance. His family walked on eggshells. His men spoke in hushed tones. The Don who had once instilled fear through observation now lived in constant suspicion, unable to distinguish true threats from imagined ones. He rarely slept, pacing late into the night, gun at his side, ears straining for sounds that might signal betrayal. Every shadow, every creak of the floorboards, every half-glance from an associate became a potential threat. Paranoia had become absolute. The city responds. Philadelphia, however, had begun to resist in subtle ways. Workers filed complaints, Businesses quietly documented irregularities, and law enforcement compiled evidence that was no longer hypothetical. The city, long silent under Scarfo's shadow, was starting to push back. Even the citizens sensed the tension. Streets that once hummed with normal life now seemed cautious, measured, almost hesitant. Philadelphia had absorbed Scarfo's paranoia, but unlike Scarfo, the city was beginning to find ways to turn that paranoia against him. By late 1987, Scarfo's empire was under siege from all sides. The paranoia that had once protected him was now the very force pushing his men into the arms of law enforcement. Open betrayal. Anthony DeLuca, once Scarfo's most trusted capo, became the first major defector. Fearing the relentless suspicion and brutal reprisals for perceived disloyalty, he began secretly cooperating with the FBI. He provided detailed information on skimming operations, union extortion, and construction kickbacks. Another soldier, Frankie Romano, provided evidence of Scarfo's internal purges, including violent punishments and disappearances. These disclosures revealed not only financial crimes but also patterns of intimidation that scarred the organization from within. The domino effect began. Soldiers whispered to one another about potential deals with federal authorities, forming an underground network of informants. Scarfo, consumed by his own fears, failed to notice these quiet alliances forming under his nose. FBI crackdowns. Federal agents, armed with insider information, launched coordinated operations. Wiretaps intercepted conversations that exposed union fraud, extortion schemes, and money laundering. Federal prosecutors prepared multiple indictments, targeting both Scarfo and his network of capos and soldiers. The authorities moved carefully but decisively. Scarfo's paranoia had created vulnerabilities. Men who feared for their lives were willing to talk in exchange for protection. Every act of suspicion, every enforced silence, became a thread the FBI could pull to unravel the empire. Family under siege. Scarfo's paranoia intensified as he sensed threats even within his own home. Family members, exhausted by years of oppressive vigilance, began expressing discontent. Children and relatives moved cautiously, fearful that any misstep could bring Scarfo's wrath. Scarfo's wife found herself mediating between the Don's volatile moods and the rest of the household. Meals were shorter, conversations clipped, and silence hung heavy over the home. The domestic sphere, once a refuge, had become another arena of suspicion and tension. Philadelphia's response. The city itself continued to press in. Contractors challenged union corruption through the courts. Journalists published exposés exposing Scarfo's influence over business and politics, and city officials began investigating irregularities that had long gone unquestioned. Citizens, once passive observers of the mob, now spoke more openly about fear and corruption. Neighborhoods that had long been silent under Scarfo's shadow were quietly resisting, documenting incidents and providing information to authorities. Scarfo's empire, built on fear and paranoia, had begun to show cracks not just internally but externally. Every public complaint, every court challenge, every newspaper headline chipped away at the illusion of absolute control. Isolation and obsession. Scarfo's paranoia reached a peak. He rarely left his residence, trusting few and suspecting all. Associates were monitored constantly, their actions catalogued, their loyalties tested endlessly. Even small mistakes could lead to violent punishment. But the tighter Scarfo tightened his grip, the more isolated he became. Capos and soldiers who had once feared him to death now plotted quietly against him. Scarfo's own vigilance had created the conditions for betrayal. The Don of Philadelphia, once untouchable, was now a man surrounded by enemies, both real and imagined. The city, the law, his family, and even his closest men had become forces conspiring against him. And yet Scarfo, consumed by suspicion, continued to act as if he remained in full control. By 1988, Nicodemo, little Nicky Scarfo's empire was unraveling in real time. The paranoia that had propelled him to the top of Philadelphia's underworld now contributed directly to its disintegration. Collapse of operations. Union skimming schemes slowed dramatically. Contractors, emboldened by legal support and federal scrutiny, withheld payments or reported irregularities. Construction projects stalled, casino skimming became increasingly risky, and the once efficient network that had pumped money into Scarfo's hands began to grind to a halt. Managers and foremen, long fearful of Scarfo, now saw a path to survival through cooperation with authorities. Every tip, every report, every whispered piece of information began feeding a mounting federal case. The Don's paranoia, which had enforced compliance for years, now encouraged men to defect quietly but decisively. Informants and betrayal. High-ranking capos, once loyal out of fear, were now actively negotiating plea deals. Testimony about union manipulation, extortion, and violent reprisals began forming a comprehensive legal dossier against Scarfo. Even his most trusted soldiers provided detailed accounts of internal purges, suspicious punishments, and financial improprieties. Each revelation reinforced the growing narrative of Scarfo's ruthless, paranoid rule. The empire that had instilled fear in thousands was now crumbling from the inside. Federal legal assault. FBI operations intensified. Agents coordinated with prosecutors to file indictments against Scarfo and his associates. Multi-count charges covered skimming, extortion, fraud, and conspiracy to commit murder. Surveillance recordings, financial records, and informant testimony left little room for defense. The law enforcement campaign was methodical. They understood Scarfo's paranoia had isolated him. By targeting multiple facets of his empire simultaneously, they created an environment where Scarfo could not respond effectively. Each strike weakened not only the infrastructure of his operations but also the perception of invincibility that had sustained his rule. Isolation at home. Scarfo's home became a fortress of fear and solitude. Family members, worn down by years of oppressive paranoia, moved quietly, spoke minimally, and began to withdraw emotionally. His wife, once a partner in navigating the treacherous world of organized crime, now maintained a careful distance. Children observed the tension but could do nothing. Scarfo's obsessions, once a tool of control, now trapped him. Nights were sleepless. Meals were solitary or short. Conversations were monitored, scrutinized, and mistrusted. The Don, who had ruled with fear as armor, now found that armor suffocating him. Public exposure. Philadelphia's newspapers chronicled the unraveling empire. Investigative articles detailed financial corruption, union coercion, and violent reprisals. Citizens, previously constrained by fear, felt empowered by public awareness and legal action. Contractors, unions, and small business owners began cooperating with authorities more openly. The city streets, once silent under Scarfo's influence, now buzzed with quiet resistance. Fear still lingered, but so did anger, and that anger translated into information, witness testimony, and evidence. Scarfo's once unquestioned shadow was fading under the glare of public and legal scrutiny. The weight of paranoia. Every move Scarfo made to secure loyalty only amplified the cracks. Threats and punishments enforced obedience, but they also deepened fear-driven defection. Informants multiplied, surveillance intensified, and the Don's empire, once an unstoppable machine, now teetered precariously. Scarfo, still consumed by paranoia, believed he could outmaneuver all threats. But the combination of law enforcement betraying soldiers, disgruntled associates, and a city tired of fear proved too formidable. The very traits that had brought him power, suspicion, isolation, and relentless control, were now accelerating his downfall. Philadelphia, the city that had once bent under Scarfo's shadow, began to reclaim itself quietly. Neighborhoods, businesses, and political structures began to resist, forming a network of observation and cooperation that Scarfo could not penetrate. The Don of paranoia, once untouchable, was trapped within a web of his own making. Philadelphia in the late 1980s never truly slept. Its streets carried whispers, its alleyways carried tension, and the very air seemed charged with unease. For years, Nicodemo little Nicky Scarfo had ruled from shadows, his paranoia shaping not only his organization but the city itself. Now, that paranoia was being tested to its limits. Scarfo could feel it. The world outside his drawn blinds was closing in. The FBI had infiltrated deeper than ever. Associates, once loyal out of fear, had begun providing information to federal authorities. Businessmen and contractors, exhausted by years of intimidation and overreach, quietly documented irregularities, contributing to a growing legal dossier. Inside his condo, Scarfo's daily rituals grew more elaborate. Locks were checked repeatedly, blinds adjusted, doors reinforced. He rarely slept for more than a few hours at a stretch. A gun remained close at hand at all times. Even a minor sound, a car door slamming, a footstep on the stairs, would set him on edge. Tensions within the family. The strain was not limited to Scarfo alone. His family felt it too. Every glance, every word, every movement could trigger suspicion. Conversations were short, polite, and tense. Children learned silence before speech, wives learned caution before affection. Scarfo's paranoia, which had once been a tool to ensure loyalty, had become a self-imposed prison. He trusted no one, suspected everyone, and increasingly he could not distinguish between real threats and imagined ones. The organization under pressure. Inside the mob, fear remained constant, but obedience was now accompanied by calculation. Capos and soldiers whispered in corners, negotiating protection with federal authorities while outwardly appearing loyal. Scarfo's methods of control, punishments, loyalty tests, silent observation, had created a network of informants he could not detect. Every meeting became a minefield. A pause too long, a glance too sharp, a misdelivered message, all could be interpreted as treachery. Scarfo enforced discipline through fear, but fear no longer guaranteed allegiance. It only guaranteed stress, errors, and defections. Law enforcement encroaches. FBI agents and prosecutors escalated their actions. Multi-count indictments were being prepared, and surveillance tapes captured incriminating conversations. Testimonies from defected capos painted a picture of systematic extortion, skimming, and violence. Scarfo's paranoia had, ironically, helped law enforcement by isolating men and making them more likely to talk. Philadelphia's law enforcement apparatus was increasingly coordinated. State police, city authorities, and federal investigators shared information, slowly closing the net. Every union dispute, every delayed construction project, every casino irregularity became another thread connecting Scarfo to evidence that would eventually indict him. Philadelphia responds. The city itself had grown restless. Business owners, long cowed into compliance, began taking cautious measures. Neighborhoods that had been silent now exchanged tips and information. Journalists reported boldly on Scarfo's activities, contributing to a climate of scrutiny and resistance. The streets reflected the tension within Scarfo's own home and organization. Workers moved cautiously. Associates whispered. Families kept silent. Even the ordinary citizens who had once accepted the shadow of the mob as inevitable, began to test boundaries, contributing to Scarfo's sense of encroaching threat. Scarfo's psychological pressure. The Don's mental state deteriorated under the compounded pressure. Paranoia reached its extreme. Every man around him was suspect. Every word could be a trap. Every shadow could conceal betrayal. His isolation intensified. Meals were solitary. Associates rarely visited, fearing judgment or worse. Family members treaded carefully, aware that any misstep could provoke violent consequences. Scarfo's empire remained vast, financially powerful, and visibly intact. But the psychological strain had created cracks that would soon widen. The very paranoia that had protected him for decades now drove men toward betrayal, encouraged law enforcement infiltration, and left Scarfo isolated in a fortress of fear that he himself had built. By 1988, Scarfo's paranoia, once the cornerstone of his empire, had begun to unravel it. The empire that had seemed invincible, the unions, construction projects, casinos, and extortion networks, was now vulnerable, exposed by internal betrayal and federal investigation. Legal pressure mounts. Federal prosecutors filed indictments targeting multiple aspects of Scarfo's operations. Charges included racketeering, extortion, illegal gambling, and conspiracy to commit murder. Evidence came from months of surveillance, financial records, and, most critically, informants from within Scarfo's organization. The FBI had painstakingly cultivated capos and soldiers, men who had once feared Scarfo above all else. Their willingness to cooperate had grown as paranoia intensified. Fear, which had enforced loyalty for years, now drove men to protect themselves by turning on their boss. Court filings outlined financial manipulation in Atlantic City casinos, illegal kickbacks from union-controlled construction contracts, and a series of violent acts against men suspected of disloyalty. For the first time, Scarfo's empire faced formal scrutiny from the law, beyond whispers or rumors. Betrayal becomes public. Several high-ranking capos agreed to testify publicly, providing detailed accounts of Scarfo's control methods, punishments, and extortion schemes. Soldiers corroborated stories of disappearances, intimidation, and financial manipulation. Scarfo's reputation, once sealed in fear, now faced public exposure. News outlets published detailed reports, showing the breadth of his operations and the depth of his paranoia-driven rule. Philadelphia began to see the Don not as untouchable, but as a man whose fear-fueled empire was crumbling. Isolation deepens. Scarfo's reaction was predictable. He retreated further into his routines, rarely leaving his home, rarely meeting associates. Even family members found themselves at a distance, unsure of how to navigate the Don's volatile moods. Meals were brief and tense. Conversations with trusted men became rare, clipped, and suspicious. Meetings with capos, when unavoidable, were exercises in vigilance, not dialogue. Scarfo trusted no one, yet relied on the same men whose loyalty was fractured. Philadelphia reacts. The city, long subdued under Scarfo's reign, now felt emboldened. Contractors resisted, unions became more cautious, and political figures pushed for investigations. Citizens reported irregularities and suspicious activities to authorities. Even Atlantic City, where Scarfo had exercised control over casinos, experienced heightened federal scrutiny. Managers and employees reported skimming operations and financial manipulations, contributing to a growing body of evidence. The psychological toll. The weight of suspicion, constant vigilance, and the realization of internal betrayal took a toll on Scarfo. Sleep became fleeting, paranoia absolute. Every movement, every whisper, every shadow was scrutinized. The empire he had built on fear had begun to turn against him. Scarfo was surrounded by people he had long controlled, yet could no longer trust. Philadelphia was no longer a city in silent compliance. It was a city gathering strength against him. And the federal legal machine, slow but methodical, was ready to capitalize on every weakness. Scarfo's empire remained financially vast and operationally functional on the surface, but the structural integrity was compromised. Every decision, every punishment, every act of paranoia had created fissures that would widen until collapse was inevitable. By 1989, the cracks in Nicodemo, little Nicky Scarfo's empire had widened into chasms. The unions, construction networks, casinos, and financial operations that had once flowed like a river now splintered under pressure from law enforcement, defecting capos, and public scrutiny. Major informants emerge. Anthony DeLuca, Frankie Romano, and several other high-ranking soldiers fully committed to cooperating with the federal authorities. Their testimonies included meticulous accounts of extortion, skimming, violent reprisals, and internal purges. Court filings detailed how Scarfo extorted union leaders and construction contractors. Skimming operations in Atlantic City casinos, including methods for laundering cash. Specific instances of violence, disappearances, and punishments against those suspected of disloyalty. These accounts painted Scarfo not as a mysterious, untouchable don, but as a man whose obsession with paranoia and control had destabilized even his most trusted allies. Legal assault intensifies. Federal prosecutors moved quickly to prepare indictments. Scarfo faced multiple charges under RICO statutes, targeting his entire network. Each testimony strengthened the case, building a legal framework that could not be ignored. FBI surveillance and recorded conversations corroborated the insider accounts. The Don's own words, once used to inspire fear among his men, now appeared in court documents as evidence of coercion, extortion, and conspiracy. The isolation deepens. Scarfo's personal world shrank dramatically. Associates avoided him, fearful of speaking openly lest their words be interpreted as betrayal. Family members walked on eggshells. Scarfo rarely left his home, trusting no one, doubting everyone. Even when surrounded by the remnants of his once powerful organization, Scarfo was alone. The paranoia that had fueled his rise now cemented his isolation. Philadelphia responds. Philadelphia, once subdued under Scarfo's influence, now felt empowered by legal and civic pressure. Business owners challenged union manipulations openly. Journalists reported aggressively on organized crime. Politicians, previously cautious, now backed investigations with public support. Atlantic City casinos also felt the shift. Employees cooperated with federal authorities, reporting skimming and illicit operations. Scarfo's control, once absolute, became tenuous. The empire crumbles. By late 1989, Scarfo's financial and operational empire was unraveling. Contractors refused to comply without federal oversight. Union leaders testified against him. Capos and soldiers provided exhaustive documentation of his control mechanisms. Casinos no longer operated under his unquestioned authority. Scarfo's paranoia remained unchanged. He suspected enemies everywhere, but it no longer protected him. It had become a self-imposed prison. Every shadow was dangerous, every whisper a threat, every glance suspect. And now, the legal system, empowered by insiders and public scrutiny, threatened to turn those suspicions into reality. Psychological collapse. Scarfo's mental state deteriorated under the compounded pressure. Sleep was rare, vigilance constant, and trust non-existent. Every day was a battle not against rivals, but against the empire he himself had built and the inevitable consequences of its unraveling. Philadelphia, long a reflection of his paranoia, now actively resisted. Men who had lived in fear now spoke. Businesses refused silent compliance. Families prepared for change. And the city, in effect, became a courtroom as much as a battlefield, a place where Scarfo's empire could be dismantled, piece, by evidence, testimony, and law. Philadelphia, 1989. The city had waited years for this moment. For nearly a decade, Nicodemo, little Nicky Scarfo, had ruled with paranoia, fear, and ruthless suspicion. He had turned unions into personal banks, construction projects into extortion schemes, and casinos into cash machines. But now, the same paranoia that had built his empire was about to drag it into collapse. The arrest. It happened quietly but decisively. Federal agents, armed with indictments spanning racketeering, extortion, gambling, and murder conspiracies, arrived at Scarfo's Atlantic City condo. The blinds were drawn as always, the rooms dim, the silence heavy. But this time, Scarfo's paranoia had not anticipated the inevitable. When the agents knocked, Scarfo didn't open the door. He lingered, pacing, muttering, gun in hand. For a moment, the dawn of suspicion seemed ready to fight the faceless system that had hunted him for years. But then reality sank in. His empire had already betrayed him. His men had already spoken. His control was already gone. He surrendered. Small, sharp-eyed, silent, he walked out into the light, surrounded by agents. The blinds of his world finally lifted. The indictments. The charges were staggering. Under RICO statutes, prosecutors laid out an empire built on fear. Union control, kickbacks, intimidation, and extortion against contractors. Casino skimming, multi-million-dollar operations siphoning profits from Atlantic City's booming industry. Construction manipulation, rigged contracts, inflated bids, and threats against developers. Violence and conspiracy, ordered hits against suspected traitors, brutal punishments for disobedience. Every piece of evidence was bolstered by insider testimony. Capos and soldiers, once Scarfo's enforcers, now became his accusers. They described meetings in hushed tones, envelopes exchanged in back rooms, punishments delivered in alleyways. Scarfo's empire, once invisible and untouchable, was now dissected in public record. The trial atmosphere. Philadelphia buzzed with anticipation as the trial began. Reporters filled the courtroom, citizens followed every headline, and businesses watched nervously. For many, Scarfo had been a ghost, a shadow whose influence was felt but rarely seen. Now he sat in plain view, small, aging, and shackled by the very paranoia that had once made him formidable. Inside the courtroom, Scarfo maintained silence. He spoke little, his expression hard, his eyes scanning every corner as if searching for hidden betrayals. To the jury he looked less like an omnipotent don and more like a man consumed by suspicion. Betrayal made flesh. The testimonies cut deepest. Men who had kissed Scarfo's ring, who had sat at his table, who had lived in fear of his eyes, now pointed fingers from the witness stand. One capo described in detail how construction contracts were manipulated, naming dates, amounts, and victims. A soldier recounted orders for punishment, how Scarfo interpreted hesitation as betrayal and enforced silence with violence. A union leader explained how workers' paychecks were siphoned, pensions drained, and projects stalled for tribute. Each word reinforced the image of Scarfo not as a visionary don, but as a paranoid tyrant whose fear destroyed his own family. Philadelphia watches. For the city, the trial was cathartic. Headlines splashed across papers daily, radio stations buzzed with updates, and citizens discussed the fall of Scarfo at street corners, diners, and bars. The fear that had silenced neighborhoods now shifted into fascination. Philadelphia was watching the dismantling of the don who had once seemed untouchable. The city, long sleepless under Scarfo's paranoia, began to breathe again, even as it waited for the verdict. Inside the courtroom. The courtroom became Scarfo's final stage. Rows of reporters filled the benches, pens scratching furiously. Federal prosecutors spoke with precision, building their case brick by brick, laying bare the empire that had once thrived on secrecy. Scarfo sat at the defense table, small in stature but still radiating an aura of suspicion. His eyes darted constantly, toward the witnesses, toward the jury, toward the gallery. He looked less like a don in command and more like a man trapped in a hall of mirrors, each reflection another potential betrayal. The evidence. Prosecutors unveiled a mountain of evidence. Wiretaps capturing Scarfo's clipped orders, demanding obedience and payments. Financial records showing skimming and laundering across casinos and construction projects. Testimonies from former associates recounting punishments and extortion. One recording played in court echoed with Scarfo's voice. Low, sharp, unmistakably paranoid. You don't hesitate. You don't think. You do what I say, or you're gone. The jury listened in silence, the weight of those words hanging heavy. Witnesses against the dawn. The most powerful blows came from Scarfo's own men. One by one, capos, soldiers, and associates took the stand. Their testimony stripped away the myth of the Don and revealed the paranoia-driven tyrant underneath. Anthony DeLuca described entire networks of construction manipulation, naming every envelope passed, every project delayed. Frankie Romano recounted violent reprisals ordered over nothing more than a raised eyebrow or a pause in speech. A union leader testified how Scarfo drained pension funds and forced workers into strikes to punish developers. Each witness spoke with a mixture of fear and relief, as if releasing years of silence. Scarfo listened without flinching, but his jaw clenched, his eyes narrowed, his suspicion radiated. He scribbled notes furiously as though cataloging betrayals even in chains. The defense falters. Scarfo's attorneys struggled. They painted the witnesses as liars, men trading truth for freedom. They called the FBI overreaching, argued that financial irregularities were coincidences, and labeled the entire prosecution a witch hunt. But the weight of evidence was too much. Documents, tapes, and testimonies aligned too neatly. The jury saw patterns of extortion, fear, and manipulation impossible to dismiss. The jury's eyes. Jurors studied Scarfo closely. At first, some admitted later they were curious. This was the man who had terrorized Philadelphia? This small, restless figure at the table? But as the trial unfolded, they saw beyond size. They saw the paranoia, the suspicion, the sharpness of his eyes. They saw a man consumed not by power but by fear. The jurors didn't just hear the evidence. They felt the weight of the paranoia that Scarfo carried into every room. And they recognized how that paranoia had destroyed lives, stolen livelihoods, and bled a city dry. The verdict approaches. As weeks turned into months, Philadelphia followed every headline. Bars played news updates on small televisions, diners buzzed with speculation, and families spoke openly about the trial over dinner. The silence Scarfo had once imposed on the city was gone. For Scarfo, each day in court was another reminder that fear could not control everything. His empire had been built on suspicion, but now suspicion was evidence, and evidence was dismantling him piece by piece. The weight of suspicion, the very thing he had wielded as a weapon, was about to come crashing down in a verdict that would end his reign forever. The verdict. The courtroom was silent when the jury filed back in. Weeks of testimony, months of evidence, years of fear, all condensed into the few words that would seal Nicodemo Scarfo's fate. The foreman stood voice steady, guilty. Racketeering. Extortion. Illegal gambling. Conspiracy to commit murder. Guilty on count after count. Each word struck like a hammer blow, dismantling the myth of invincibility Scarfo had carried for decades. Scarfo sat still, jaw clenched, eyes unblinking. He betrayed no emotion, but his silence spoke louder than rage. For the first time, the dawn of suspicion was powerless, not because men feared him but because the law had bound him. Reaction in the courtroom. The gallery erupted in whispers. Reporters scribbled furiously, some rushing out to phone in the news. Families of victims exchanged glances of relief. Union leaders who had once been puppets now exhaled freely. Scarfo's family sat stone-faced. They had lived in his shadow for years, conditioned by suspicion and silence. Now, in public, under the glare of cameras and spectators, they shared the humiliation of his downfall. Philadelphia responds. The city reacted almost instantly. Headlines screamed, "Scarfo guilty." Radio stations buzzed with celebratory calls. Bars and diners, once places where Scarfo's name was whispered cautiously, now spoke it openly, loudly, freely. Contractors, workers, and small business owners saw hope for the first time in years. The unions, long strangled by Scarfo's grip, began to rebuild under cautious new leadership. Atlantic City casinos, once milked for hidden profits, welcomed scrutiny if it meant freedom from the mob. Philadelphia, the sleepless city Scarfo had ruled with paranoia, finally began to rest. Scarfo behind bars. Scarfo's life changed overnight. No longer the Don in command, he became inmate 08911-050. His world shrank to a cell, his audience reduced to guards and fellow prisoners. The blinds, the locks, the silence, his old rituals, were meaningless now. But the paranoia never left. Even in prison he distrusted everyone. Meals were eaten with suspicion. Conversations were guarded. He carried the same watchfulness, the same sharpness of eye, as though betrayal still lurked in every shadow. The irony was complete. The man who had built an empire on suspicion now lived in a place where suspicion was useless. He was no longer feared. He was contained. The city without him. Philadelphia moved on, though scars remained. The unions carried the weight of corruption. Businesses remembered the cost of silence. Families remembered lives lost to paranoia and fear. But the city breathed easier. Scarfo's name, once spoken in whispers, now served as a cautionary tale, a reminder of how fear can build an empire, and how that same fear can destroy it. The clang of the prison gate was unlike anything Scarfo had heard before. It was final, metallic, absolute. For decades, Nicodemo little Nicky Scarfo had moved through the world like a shadow, controlling men with silence and suspicion. Now his universe had been reduced to 6 feet by 8, with bars that didn't bend to fear. The new world. Prison was its own empire, governed by rules as old as the streets but enforced differently. Scarfo entered with the reputation of a don, a man whose paranoia and ruthlessness had ruled Philadelphia. But here titles mattered less. Respect had to be earned or bought, and suspicion, though useful, could not replace the brute realities of confinement. Other inmates watched him with curiosity. Some respected his reputation, whispering stories of the don who had ruled through silence. Others saw only a small, aging man, stripped of his soldiers and his empire, armed with nothing but sharp eyes and old habits. Scarfo carried himself the same way he always had: measured steps, clipped speech, constant observation. But in prison the effect was diminished. Men noticed, yes, but they did not fear. Rituals and confinement. Old habits clung to him. He checked locks on his cell door even though guards controlled them. He arranged his few possessions neatly, as though order itself could provide security. He ate cautiously, scanning faces, suspecting tampering even in institutional meals. Sleep remained elusive. Scarfo woke often, pacing his narrow space, listening for footsteps, convinced betrayal might come even here. Other inmates mocked his restlessness. Some admired it. But to Scarfo it wasn't a choice. It was who he was. Letters and visits. Outside the prison walls, Scarfo's family struggled with the weight of his conviction. Visits were tense affairs. Conversations with his wife and children were clipped, guarded, filled with suspicion even in those rare moments of intimacy. Scarfo asked questions constantly. Who had spoken to whom? Who had visited which neighborhood? Who was still loyal? He demanded answers, but the world outside had moved on. Men who once obeyed him were building new lives, or testifying in new cases, or buried by old betrayals. Each visit reminded Scarfo that his empire no longer existed. His paranoia persisted, but his power did not. The don without a throne. Inmates expected Scarfo to command respect, to rule even behind bars. Some sought his approval, hoping to bask in the reflected glow of his legend. But Scarfo's suspicion made alliances impossible. He distrusted everyone: cellmates, guards, fellow mobsters. Every gesture was a potential threat, every offer a trap. Without loyalty, without fear, Scarfo became a man alone. His throne had been paranoia, but paranoia could not rule in a place where no one cared. Philadelphia without him. Back in Philadelphia, the streets adjusted. The vacuum Scarfo left behind was filled by others, some more charismatic, some less paranoid, all eager to rebuild what he had broken. The city still carried scars. Unions scarred by corruption, casinos scarred by skimming, families scarred by violence. But life moved forward. Scarfo, once the axis around which everything turned, was now a memory fading into court documents and newspaper clippings. He remained physically alive, but in many ways Scarfo was already a ghost. The aging dawn. Time, more than prison walls, became Scarfo's enemy. By the early 1990s, his hair had thinned, his body shrank, and his health began to falter. The sharp-eyed don who once paced Atlantic City condos now shuffled slowly through prison corridors. Yet his paranoia remained intact, perhaps sharper than ever. He suspected guards of tampering with his food. He suspected fellow inmates of whispering about him. Even doctors who checked his blood pressure or prescribed medication were seen as potential conspirators. Scarfo never surrendered suspicion. It was the last weapon he had left. Fragile alliances. In prison, alliances were fragile currency. Some mobsters tried to approach him, offering solidarity from the outside world. Others avoided him, wary of his reputation for suspicion. Scarfo's inability to trust made friendships impossible. He remained aloof, eating alone, speaking little, watching always. Younger inmates whispered about him. To them, Scarfo was more myth than man, a story from the streets, a ghost of Philadelphia's violent past. Some admired him. Some mocked him. Scarfo himself cared little. He distrusted admiration as much as derision. Family at a distance. Visits grew infrequent. His wife aged alongside him, weary from years of suspicion and absence. His children built lives outside the shadow of their father's paranoia. They visited out of obligation, not devotion. Conversations were strained, punctuated by Scarfo's endless questions about loyalty, betrayal, and who still remembered him on the outside. But Philadelphia no longer whispered his name in fear. It barely whispered it at all. Scarfo was learning the cruelest lesson. Paranoia could keep him alive, but it could not keep him relevant. The forgotten dawn. By the late 1990s, Scarfo was fading from public memory. New bosses, new wars, new scandals filled headlines. The dawn of suspicion, once the most feared man in Philadelphia, became a footnote in broader stories about organized crime. Inside his cell, Scarfo still lived by old rules. He checked his possessions obsessively. He distrusted guards and inmates alike. He kept his posture sharp, his eyes scanning. But the empire those habits had once protected no longer existed. His paranoia had no kingdom left to rule. The city moves on. Philadelphia moved forward. Construction projects continued under new oversight. Unions rebuilt slowly, though scars remained. Casinos thrived, glittering with tourists who no longer thought of envelopes passed in shadows. The city Scarfo once ruled with silence had reclaimed its voice. He was a relic now, a ghost trapped behind bars, a man living in a past that no longer shaped the present. Scarfo's sleepless nights continued, but they were no longer the city's. The decline. By the 2000s, Scarfo was no longer the sharp-eyed Don who had once terrified Philadelphia. His body gave way to age and illness, heart troubles, breathing difficulties, the slow erosion of strength. Yet even as his health declined, the paranoia remained. He refused to trust prison doctors, questioning every pill, every injection. He eyed nurses with suspicion as though they too were part of an endless conspiracy. Guards who wheeled him to appointments recalled his constant muttering, his insistence on knowing who had spoken to whom, who had passed by his cell. Paranoia had outlived power. A life of silence. In the yard, Scarfo rarely spoke. He sat alone, small and hunched, eyes scanning the horizon of fences and barbed wire. Younger inmates saw him as a relic, once powerful, now frail. Some whispered his name with curiosity, others ignored him entirely. Scarfo neither sought nor welcomed attention. Suspicion kept him apart. The Don who once commanded rooms with silence now inhabited silence like a shroud. Family fades away. By then, family visits were rare. His wife aged in parallel, exhausted by decades of absence and mistrust. Children who had grown up in the shadow of paranoia built their own lives, far from the empire their father had destroyed. Letters dwindled. Conversations shortened. For Scarfo, every absence reinforced suspicion. He wondered who had betrayed him, who had forgotten him, who might still fear him. The truth was simpler and harsher. Philadelphia no longer cared. The end. On January 13, 2017, Nicodemo, little Nicky, Scarfo died in federal custody at age 87. The Don of suspicion, who had once ruled a city through paranoia and silence, passed away not in his Atlantic City condo with blinds drawn, not in a union hall surrounded by loyal men, but in a prison hospital bed watched over by guards. There was no mourning city, no outpouring of grief. Obituaries noted his death, chronicling his paranoia, his violence, his reign of fear. But Philadelphia moved on with barely a pause. Legacy of fear. Scarfo's name, once spoken in whispers of dread, became a cautionary tale. He was remembered not as a mastermind, but as a tyrant consumed by paranoia, a man whose fear turned loyalty into betrayal, whose suspicion dismantled the very empire it was meant to protect. Philadelphia carried his scars, in unions weakened, in businesses drained, in families scarred by violence. But it also carried his lesson. Fear can control, but it cannot sustain. Scarfo's paranoia had been his weapon. In the end, it became his cage, his downfall, his legacy. When Nicodemo, little Nicky, Scarfo died in 2017, the city of Philadelphia did not mourn. The news was carried in papers, noted on evening broadcasts, but it came and went like any other headline. For decades, Scarfo had dominated the city's underworld, twisting unions, construction, and casinos into his machine of fear. Yet by the time his heart stopped, his name was no longer a threat, only a memory. But scars remain. Cities do not forget so easily even when the fear is gone. The Union Halls. In the years after Scarfo's fall, Philadelphia's unions struggled to rebuild. They had been drained of funds, their reputations tainted by corruption, their members scarred by years of intimidation. Workers spoke cautiously at meetings, memories of whispered threats still lingering. Younger generations, too young to remember Scarfo directly, inherited the suspicion. They asked why contracts were so heavily scrutinized, why leaders moved so carefully. The answer was always the same, because once, a paranoid Don had ruled them like pawns, and no one wanted to see that darkness return. The businesses, contractors and developers remembered too. For decades, envelopes had been part of every budget, delays and strikes tools of coercion. Even after Scarfo was gone, businessmen calculated risk differently. They invested with caution, built with suspicion, and taught their successors to look closely at every handshake. Philadelphia's skyline rose higher in the 1990s and 2000s, new towers gleaming against the sky. But in their foundations lay memories of Scarfo's manipulation, ghostly reminders that every brick once carried a tax of fear. The families of the fallen. For the families of those who had disappeared, who had been beaten, who had been silenced, Scarfo's death brought no closure. His paranoia had turned suspicions into sentences, hesitation into execution. Widows still remembered the night knocks on their doors. Children still remembered the whispers that their fathers had talked too much, or hesitated too long. Scarfo's empire had dissolved, but its shadows stretched across generations. The law learns. Law enforcement carried its own lessons. Scarfo's empire had taught them that paranoia created both strength and weakness. They saw how fear could bind men together, but also how it could drive them to betray one another. The FBI's patient infiltration of Scarfo's world became a model for later operations. Informants, surveillance, and the careful cultivation of dissent, all were sharpened by lessons learned from dismantling the dawn of paranoia. Philadelphia's awakening. For the city itself, Scarfo's fall marked a slow awakening. Neighborhoods that had been silenced found their voices again. Newspapers reported more boldly. Citizens resisted more openly. Philadelphia learned to live without Scarfo's shadow. But the city never fully forgot what it had been like to exist under the weight of suspicion. Even decades later, stories were told in diners and on street corners, about the small man with the sharp eyes who trusted no one, who ruled through silence, and who destroyed himself with the very fear he imposed on others. Cultural shifts. Philadelphia in the 1990s and 2000s began to shed its skin. The mob still existed, of course, crime never vanished, but the city had changed. The suffocating silence of Scarfo's era gave way to a new openness. Politicians no longer whispered deals in smoke-filled rooms. Business owners no longer built envelope fees into every contract. Union halls, once dens of fear, hosted debates again. Scarfo had left scars, but scars can also be reminders. And for Philadelphia, the reminder was clear. Never again could one man's paranoia be allowed to choke the life from the city. A new generation. Young Philadelphians grew up hearing stories of Scarfo as if he were a ghost. They knew his name but not his presence. They saw him in newspaper clippings, in courtroom sketches, in whispered anecdotes passed down by parents and grandparents. To them, Scarfo was less a man than a warning. A cautionary tale about power without trust, leadership without loyalty, control without love. He had ruled by suspicion, and suspicion had destroyed him. The vanishing shadow. As the decades passed, Scarfo's influence faded further. His name appeared in documentaries, in books about organized crime, in late-night conversations among the old-timers. But the streets that once fell silent at the mention of little Nicky, now bustled freely. The boardwalk in Atlantic City glittered without his shadow. The unions held meetings without fear. The city that had once been sleepless under his gaze finally learned to rest. The lesson of Scarfo. Scarfo's story lingered not because of his power, but because of his downfall. He had shown Philadelphia that paranoia could be a weapon, but it was also a poison. Fear could control men, but it could not sustain them. Silence could command obedience, but it could not inspire loyalty. His empire had collapsed not because of external enemies alone, but because his own suspicion corroded it from within. Scarfo had taught his men to fear him, and in the end that fear drove them to betray him. The awakening. Philadelphia emerged from Scarfo's shadow with hard-won wisdom. It rebuilt its unions, reformed its businesses, and confronted its own complicity. It carried scars, yes, but also resilience. Scarfo's life, his paranoia, and his fall became a parable whispered in classrooms, discussed in documentaries, dissected by historians. The dawn of suspicion had left behind no legacy of loyalty, no empire of respect. Only a caution. Power built on fear may rise, but it cannot endure. And so, the city awakened. Nicodemo, little Nicky, Scarfo once ruled Philadelphia with silence, suspicion, and fear. But in the end, the same paranoia that built his empire destroyed it. His life behind blinds, his sleepless nights, his suspicious gaze, all became his prison long before the federal gates closed around him. Philadelphia, scarred but unbroken, outlived him. The dawn of paranoia was gone. The city remained.